This is the second demonstration video showing Nick Satinover's reductive flats method to chromolithography. We are at the washout stage and we are preparing to print. The video will proceed through printing and also the first reduction leading into the second layer of printing. At this point, I am over in front of the fume hood and I am using lithotripsy to wash out my roll-up. Now, this is a color process, and so we need to wash out this black really well, otherwise it will alter the color that we print with. This is why Nick prefers lithotripsy for this, because the Johnson's paste wax would just take even longer to wash out all of this ink thoroughly. Make sure you are wearing gloves, and like I said, you're in front of the ventilation, and try to use the lithotripsy sparingly, although I needed quite a bit. Nick had recommended spreading it out on your glove or using your glove so that it doesn't absorb into the rag as much, and that was working somewhat for me, but I ended up kind of just using the rag to move it around a little bit more. Once you have done your washout, do your rub up with Johnson's paste wax. Ideally, you will also do this in front of the ventilation, although I had already moved my stone for the video process and just went ahead and did it on the press bed. But as long as your stone is over there in front of the vents, that would be the better time to rub up. Make sure you get a nice, solid, even coat and that you notice the color changing in your image areas everywhere. Next, you will pull up the gum with a wet rag, and then you can start inking up. Now, I have already prepared a blend roll with my colors, and I have planned out where they will lay. I will talk a little bit more about ink preparation for the second layer. Because we're rolling up these flats, we want to keep our brayer in the same place, and so in this case you don't actually lift your brayer up and down and rotate it as you're rolling, but you will move your brayer to a different position on the slab when you're recharging your ink, and then when you return to your stone, you will keep it set down in the same position and roll it back and forth. I'm rolling about 5 rolls per pass, and I'm doing 3 passes before pulling a print. So you can see the color coming up here, and I should be ready to pull a proof. I haven't set my pressure yet or the placement of my magnets for my start and stop point, so I'm doing that now. Also, be really mindful of where you place your tympan. It needs to be put down after the registration pins, so it's not sitting on top of them, it's just beyond them. Likewise, you will never put down your scraper bar on top of those registration tabs because they would cut the scraper bar and then it would have these divots and it would print white or these light stripes across your image and it would need to get restretched. So it's really important that you're mindful of where those tabs are. In regard to newsprint, Nick recommends using 2 sheets of newsprint on top of your good paper or on top of your proofing paper to provide a little bit of packing. I've pulled my first proof. It's a little bit light, which is to be expected for the first proof. So I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. I noticed that it was maybe a little bit off center, and so I'm just double checking the placement of my stone there. with the scraper bar and tightening my pressure just a quarter turn, and I will continue inking. Here's my first pass. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rolls. Keep my stone damp. Recharge. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rolls. Recharge. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rolls. I should be ready to pull my second proof. And this one should come up stronger than the last one did. And here is my second proof. The colors are looking good, so I'm ready to move on to my good paper. So now I'm ready to pull my first good sheet. I am putting the paper face down with the registration pins. The big reveal. So that color looks pretty good, but maybe a little bit weak, so I might recharge my ink just a little bit more, and then I'm going to keep printing. If I weren't happy with the color, then I would have to modify the colors on my slab and proof some more until I was happy with the color. But you should have a pretty good sense of the color from your proofs anyway, so this first layer shouldn't be too much of a surprise. I was also finding that the static with my tympan was a challenge in pulling up my newsprint. And so I would recommend kind of putting the tympan down at an angle and almost placed right where you'll want it to be, but then you can kind of slide it to the right toward the registration pins. And that was working pretty well for me. Whereas if I kind of hovered the tympan horizontally, then it would come up, like the newsprint would kind of jump up and stick. So you'll print all of your pieces of paper that you've prepared. This is what my first layer looks like. Now I can proceed to closing down my stone and the reduction process. Before closing down your stone, you will ink it up again so that it is a nice solid layer of ink. Then you will fan your stone dry and you'll talc your stone. You can just scoop the talc rosin mixture out of the bin. You don't necessarily need to use rosin in this situation because we are trying to use a really hot etch and burn the ink out, so there's no real need for the rosin to protect the image in this case. After you talc, you will apply a pure gum and then buff it down with cheesecloth. Then take your stone back over to the fume hood area and do a washout. This is the step you will do before applying the contact paper, which you will then cut to create your stencil. So I'm rubbing the lithotripsine around with my glove to get the ink in solution through the gum stencil. And again, just try to use as little lithotripsine as you can get away with, but you're trying to remove all of the ink in this situation. So keep in mind that this is essentially a washout, and then later, after we cut our stencil, we will still need to do a rub up with Johnson's paste wax before we can proceed to printing. And we're just washing out the ink at this stage so that the acid can act even more easily upon the stone. I have gotten all of the ink off of my stone, so now I can apply a layer of contact paper over the entire stone. I'm wrangling a little bit with this contact paper because it tore as I was removing it from the face. But if it comes off in one clean piece, you can start with one edge of the contact paper and get that affixed to your stone, and then you can use the resistance of the part that's already attached to kind of pull the rest away. And you're trying to not have any air bubbles, so I'm going to use an intaglio kind of scraper to lay this down a little bit better. And I'm starting from the middle, kind of working outwards to get rid of those air bubbles. And it's a little bit shy on that one spot on the bottom, but I'll hopefully be cutting out right there anyway, and my paper is a little bit smaller than my image, so I think it'll be fine. Now I'm going to remove any of the contact paper where I will apply an etch. So this means I should be looking at the first layer of my print and deciding what parts I want to keep. So anything that I want to stay that periwinkle to darker blue gradient is what I need to cut out. So I had planned to cut out these rays of light, so I'm doing that first. And then I'm going to cut out every other stripe down the background of the image and remove that. So if you think about it, whatever you remove with the contact paper is also where you will remove image area from your stone by using a hot etch. And again, that will be preserving when I print again on top of my paper. All of the areas I've removed will be preserved. So I'm using an X-Acto blade. A box cutter would probably be better because the tip would be less fragile, and this tip bent fairly easily. And you're trying to apply the amount of pressure that you need to cut through the contact paper, but not to cut the stone. And you can see I'm getting in the way here a lot because I'm trying to really see these invisible lines, and you need to make sure that you cut your corners well. It's much easier to cut with a fresh blade. With all of the cuts I had to make, I ended up using 3 blades. When you're cutting, be mindful of where your non-dominant hand is. You never want to cut toward your hand. I'm using a straight edge to cut toward myself. If you're using a straight edge, you don't want to cut away from yourself because you can lose control moving away, but you still really want to be mindful of what is in front of your blade as you pull down. With tight corners, I would recommend starting in the corner and pulling away in multiple directions. So accessing your stone from multiple directions might make it a little bit easier. And moving your whole body, like as I have to carve that curve, I'm moving my whole arm and body so that I can make a smooth mark there. And then also to avoid confusion, I'm pulling off my stripes as I go. Because the contact paper is adhered to the stone, you can make more intricate stencil cuts than you would if you had to lift it off and it had to have structural integrity. That means that you can have holes within things that aren't necessarily attached to what's outside of it. And if you've ever cut a paper stencil, I think you'll know what I mean. But that said, if you have really intricate details, then this might be a challenging task, and straight lines are easier than curved lines in general. The only time I cut myself during this process was when I was lifting up some of the contact paper and trying to catch it with my non-dominant thumb, and I sort of slipped and sliced into my thumb a little bit. So be careful when you're picking up the pieces as well. If you don't have fingernails, you'll want to use the blade to kind of get under the contact paper and try to pull it up. And then you'll want to be careful at corners to see whether anything is still connected in a place that you thought that you had cut. I switched to stop motion so that you didn't have to watch me painstakingly do all of this. It did take quite a while to cut all of these pieces, but this is my most time-intensive layer in terms of stencil cutting, and subsequent layers will be quicker. Now that I have cut my stencil and removed the contact paper from any places that I want to remain my first color that I printed, I am ready to do a reductive etch. For this, you will use the border gum that already has an unknown amount of acid in it, and additionally, you will add 40 drops of nitric acid to an ounce of border gum. And then mix that together well, and then you will apply it to your stone. I'm just going to go for it directly onto the stone because the point is to obliterate the image area, so I can't really do damage by dropping it directly on my image. I should be careful as I'm brushing to try not to lift the contact paper stencil that I have down. And there were a couple of weak points that did lift up a little bit, and then I was careful to brush opposite the way that they were flapping a little bit. And that's just because of those delicate stripes I have that had probably already been pulled up a little bit. So if you have a distressed area, then that might be a little bit more at risk of not holding up. You will notice, because this is such a hot etch, that it foams white immediately. And over time, you should see your stone change color. So the color of the stone under the contact paper should be fairly distinct from the color of the stone that is open. And the gum will get a little bit dirty looking. So just keep working it around for a few minutes. I don't have this portion of the video sped up at all because I wanted you to see or get a feel for the amount of time that I spent etching my stone. Once you've worked this etch in for a little while, then you can dab the excess up with cheesecloth and let it dry. You may have noticed that I've been wearing gloves through this process. This is a super hot etch, and so I wouldn't want it to burn my skin if I touched it. And so I would recommend wearing gloves. That way you don't have to be super careful about where your brush is and how you're touching the cheesecloth at every moment. Just to reiterate, you don't need to buff down this gum. You will just thin it out a little bit and then allow it to dry completely before you start the rub up and inking up. Here is Nick Satinover doing the same step on his stone after printing the first layer. So he is removing that kind of geometric swirl from this left side of the stone from our view. And you can see he's protecting the other side of the stone because on that side he's doing a different process where he rubs up with the paste wax and then does the etch through the paste wax, and that's how he's getting that more bubbly effect. So we'll go over that in a second. But you can watch his technique here doing the same thing, and the stone is changing color. He is using the brush to get into those lines repeatedly. And this is sped up about triple time, just to give you a sense of timing. Now he's dabbing carefully just to avoid lifting up, and then we will let this dry before we move into the other side of the stone with the paste wax method. So the left side of Nick's stone, which he has already etched, is dry, and he has then rubbed up the right side of his stone with Johnson's paste wax, and then he'll be painting that same hot etch into it in a more painterly way. It will give that droplet look that you see in his print. The paste wax repels the gum arabic a little bit, and so that's what makes those droplets. He also has a cool trick with the graphite. So drawing through the Johnson's paste wax displaces it a little bit, and that makes the stone more vulnerable in those areas. And so when he etches, it can leave a mark. And so that's how he achieved that gridded look with the droplets through it, sort of. So we'll see him paint that on in a second. And on the right side of that print, you can see that he also did this painterly method. Sorry about the wobbly image. I was hand holding the camera during this part of his demo. Also note that he has the text protected here because he wants that to continue to print darker. So there are little pieces of contact paper over it. And you could strategically use contact paper as a stencil and then apply the paste wax in part of your stone and then paint into it. If you were to just leave this to dry, then he would get those distinct beads as they pull together more than he will get the little droplets and more washy look. But as he continues to paint, he'll get a little bit more of that faded look that has more nuance to it than the pure droplets. And anywhere that the gum is left to dry will remove more of that image area there. So he's just going over it multiple times. Because the other side is already dry, he's just taking the time to pull up the remaining contact paper, and it's sort of fun and mesmerizing to watch. And then you can see the different color of the etched stone and the image area that remains on the stone. My etch solution is now dry, so I am able to pull up the remaining contact paper stencil that had been on my stone. It's important at this point that you remember to do the rub up, because remember a while ago we did the washout, but then we put down the stencil, we cut out the stencil, then we applied the etch, And so I think it could be easy to forget this step because it's divorced from the usual washout. I noticed that I had missed a piece of plastic, and so I was just double checking that in a couple of spots there were some strips that I didn't see. But once I did the rub up, I could see the change in color, and so that was helpful to make sure I didn't miss anything. So again, you're establishing grease in those image areas, but the gum is down everywhere else, and so it's protecting the stone and the non-image areas there. And then you can use a blue shop towel with some water to get up all of that gum that is a little bit thicker than usual on your stone. So it might take a little bit to dissolve all the gum and get that up before you can move into sponging and inking up. So again, I am rolling and not lifting up my brayer to keep things in line and to avoid pass marks. Although now all these stripes won't show that as much as a big flat area would. And I have a few funky spots in that center ellipse, but ultimately they go away. So I guess if you have some areas that don't come up quite evenly, hopefully they'll just come up on their own. At first, I'm just going to check the image and bring it up on some plain newsprint. And the second time I print, I will print it over the colors that I already have to see how they're stacking. I have been reusing my newsprints from my first layer, and you can do that as well. Especially if you've put some dryer in your ink, they should be dry enough to reuse by the time you get to the next layer. So this is what the two colors look like on top of each other, even though the registration is off from the first newsprint to the second newsprint because I was just winging it. But it does give me a good enough sense of the color, and I'm happy with it, so that's great. I can move on to printing on the good paper. You can see how it would be beneficial to have a few sheets of newsprint that are printed with the colors that you have already printed so that you can gauge your next color and how it will lay on top of that. If I were not happy with my second color, then I would have to go back and mix my inks a little bit differently. I tend to start with a lighter color, knowing that it's a lot easier to make my colors darker directly on the slab because I can just intensify them and then add them to my slab and roll them out, and they will automatically be just a little bit darker or a little bit brighter. But it's hard to make them lighter without scraping everything up, remixing your ink, cleaning your brayer, putting it back down. And so I tend to be a little bit more cautious in that sense. If you were totally blindsided and some color mixture happened, it would be worth changing. If need be, you could do a wet wash and change your colors. You may have to even clean your brayer. But hopefully, if you talk with me and we figure out a color plan, you'll have a little bit of a sense of how those stack before you move forward. And here is the big reveal of my sheer pink to raspberry to kind of midnight stacking over my initial blend. And I am happy with those colors, so I can go ahead and print the rest of the edition. Once you've printed your edition, you can repeat the steps that I've already shown. So that would include rolling up the stone again so that it has a solid base of ink, adding talc, buffing down gum, then doing a washout, applying your contact paper, cutting another stencil, etching it out, letting that dry, rubbing up with Johnson's paste wax, rolling up with your next color, ad infinitum.